Hello and welcome to Good Evening Britain, a Force for Good's weekly show coming to you live from our studios here in the heart of the great British city of Glasgow with me, your host, Alistair McConnachie. We are broadcasting on all our digital platforms throughout the United Kingdom and across the world. We're bringing you quality, pro-UK comment and analysis every Wednesday from 7 until 8 p.m. on Facebook, on YouTube, on X, and also on TikTok. We have a packed show for you tonight on this great British summer evening. Please tell us where you're watching from. Please send in your greetings. Please wish us the best of British as we wish you, the viewer, the best of British tonight. Now, at the bottom of the hour, we're very excited about our guest tonight, who is the American author, artist, and musician, Avellina Balestri. And she's been on our show before, and she's going to be telling us about her new history book, which is also a drama book. And that's Avellina there at a monument. And I'll ask her exactly where that is, but that was when she was in Britain, I think, either last year or perhaps the year before. And she's standing there in front of General Wolfe, the victor on the plains of Abraham in Quebec, the man for whom modern Canada credits with being British today. And Avellina, albeit an American, is a very strong British cultural patriot as well. And her books and her writings reflect that fact. So we're looking forward to chatting with Avellina about not only her new book, but also the political situation in America at the moment, which is, as we know, very fluid, very interesting, and very dramatic. Now, folks, if you're watching on TikTok, you won't see the interview with Avellina, so you'll need to go over to our YouTube site, which is youtube.com/UK A Force for Good. That's coming up at 7:30. But before then, we're going to be examining the statistics of the general election to find out just how many people in Scotland voted for the anti-UK parties, to give us some idea of just their support, or at least the support of people who are bothered enough to get out of bed and go and vote for them. So that's coming up shortly. Let's say hello to one or two people here who have come in the comments. And let's see if we can't make this work. Here we go. Derek's first in. Says, good evening, Alistair and fellow unionists around the world. I hope everyone is doing well. And he's looking forward to seeing Avellina in the chat at 7:30. Hello to JD, who says it's his first time here. Well, hopefully not your last, JD. We're always looking to welcome new people. Please do comment. Please do give us your thoughts. From South Lanarkshire, Derek says, welcome, JD, and nice to see you here. Also, Nick from the We Say It podcast. Check out Nick on rumble.com/We Say It podcast. A great podcaster from Scotland. Hi to Oksana and to TC. We Say It says, in Donald we trust. Well, thank goodness Donald's still with us. He had a little bit of a brush with fate the other day, didn't he? Hello to Eric. Nice to see Eric, who says, hello, fellow unionists. And Oksana says, Avellina is interesting. She most certainly is a very talented woman, is Oksana. And Laird Kilbarchan, good to see you, sir. Good evening, everyone. Send in your comments and thoughts. Now, let us look at the results of the general election. Now, we've been looking at these, and we've been trying to find different angles on them and so on. And it occurred to us, well, what was the actual total vote of all the people in Scotland who voted for what might be called, for want of a better expression, the anti-UK parties, by which I'm talking about those that want a second referendum to break up the United Kingdom, to attempt to break up the United Kingdom. How many people who believe in that actually bothered to vote for the parties that advocate that, which is to say the Scottish National Party, the Scottish Cabbage Party, aka the Green Party, Alex Salmond's ALBA, and a couple of very small parties in against what we might call, very broadly and very generously, the pro-UK parties, which is to say the parties that at least don't want to have another referendum to try to break up the United Kingdom, by which, of course, I'm talking about the Tories, the Labour, the Lib Dems, and the smaller parties that made their position on that clear, which is to say Reform, UK independence, British unionists. And so we looked at the figures on Wikipedia and we added them all together, and that appears in our article, SNP Down to Single Figures, which is on our website, aforceforgood.uk/blog. But we've taken a graphic out of that, and let's put the graphic up here, which explains, which adds it all together in a very useful way. There we go. 2024 general election in Scotland. The 57 seats won as follows. Labour, of course, got the bulk at 37. SNP lost so many seats. They lost 39 seats from their 2019 election. Lib Dems were up 2 to 6 and Conservatives down 1 to 5. And there we've added up the total vote for what we're calling the pro-UK parties in Scotland. Labour, Conservative, Lib Dems, Reform UK, British Unionists, Social Democratic, UK Independence and Heritage. And the total is 1,563,031, which works out at, let's call that 65% of the total vote, 64.73. And then we've added up the total vote for the anti-UK parties in Scotland. That's SNP, Scottish Greens, ALBA, Scottish Socialist, and a couple of small parties called Independence for Scotland and another called Sovereignty. And the total for that is 831,216. So let's call that 34.5% of the total vote. Now, there were other parties and there was quite a few independent candidates standing, and either their stance is unknown or they don't take a position on the matter. And that just came to less than 1% of the total vote at 20,563. And you look at the total vote there altogether, and that doesn't include spoiled ballots, I might add, 2,414,810, or 59.2% of the turnout. And so that was way down. The turnout was way down. Okay. The turnout was way down on previous years. The previous years, let's see, 2019, the turnout there you can see was 68.1% in Scotland. So that's down 10%, but that was mirrored throughout all of the United Kingdom. Turnout was way down. I guess people were just not enamored with it. And so a lot of the Scottish nationalists stayed at home. A lot of them did not vote. And of course, a large number would also vote for Labour as well. So you have about 500,000 people who voted for the SNP last time and who this time have either stayed at home or gone over to the Labour. To give us that figure of 831,216. Now, interestingly enough, it's very difficult to find, and this is kind of ridiculous, right? But it's difficult to find the exact number of what the electorate actually was. And if you can find the electorate in Scotland on the 4th of July 2014, then please tell us. But if we extrapolate from that figure, if that figure of 2,414,810 is 59.2, then one is looking at an electorate of 4,079,071, thereabouts, which means that the anti-UK vote would come in at around 20% of the overall Scottish electorate. Around 20% of the overall Scottish electorate. Now, on the day, it was, what have we got there? On the day, it was, as you see there, 34.42% of the total vote, which is around about a third. Around about a third of the total vote. But if you look at the actual percentage of the total electorate, it's round about a fifth, 20%. So that's not a lot. Not a lot at all. In fact, that's way down on what we would expect. We would expect around about 25%. But 20% will settle for that. So the Scottish nationalists are not gaining ground, they're clearly losing ground. And we'll have an exact figure which we will add to our definitive article on the matter on our website, entitled SNP Down to Single Figures. When we get that definitive number for the electorate in Scotland on the 4th of July, then we'll calculate it down to the second decimal point. But just a few words also on the general electorate. When searching to try to find the figure today, I went onto the British Parliamentary website, and let's see if I can bring this up here. They do have a PDF. And here it is here. Now, going down to turnout. Here we are. Turnout, this is across the whole of the United Kingdom, was 59.8, let's call it 60%, down from 67.3 in 2019. The total registered electorate was 48.2 million. Now wait for this, 600,000 higher than the 47.6 million electorate in 2019. So in the course of one parliamentary session, the electorate in the UK has risen by 600,000, and it will be more than that when we get the exact figure. 600,000 600,000 in the course of a parliamentary term. You see, many of the constituencies in the United Kingdom are always on a, they're in a very fine balance. And governments can be elected or deposed on just a few hundred or a few thousand or a few tens of thousands of votes nationwide. But if you're changing the electorate at such a level, and an additional 600,000 in the space of one parliamentary term of 5 years, or not even 5 years, 4.5 years, then that's crazy. That's very notable. It means that basically all seats are up for grabs because you're changing the demographics of each constituency to such an extent that it's going to become impossible to actually know, is this a Labour constituency or is it a Tory constituency or what? And of course, these are immigrants that are coming in, and immigrants generally vote left, which is to say they vote for Labour. We all know that. Okay, sure, there's immigrants who don't vote for Labour. And if you're one of them, you've probably got a very good chance of having a career in the Tory party. But generally speaking, immigrants vote left, they vote Labour. And so these changes are coming in hugely throughout the United Kingdom and indeed the Western world. But it's interesting that it's difficult to find now what the actual electorate figure is. And we've just found out today that it's £600,000, 600,000 people more than it was in 2019. And the SNP is owing £600,000 as well back to their membership. Now, folks, we've got our guest coming up at the bottom of the hour. That's Avellina Balestri, the American author, artist, and musician, going to be talking about her new book and also talking about the state of American politics today. And if you're watching on TikTok, you can see Avellina. There she is there on our YouTube page. What if says the actual Irish who live in Scotland are turning... No, the actual Irish who live in the Republic of Ireland are turning right, says What If on... John Doyle says, let's move on to immigration. Absolutely, it's the big issue. Absolutely, it's the big issue, because a democracy depends upon who's voting. And if you're changing who's voting, you're changing the democracy completely. And you're also losing faith with the people as well. And we see that today with the carry on with Keir Starmer and the two-child benefit cap. And most people, I would aver, don't mind if you abolish the two-child benefit cap, because 2 children, 3 children, 4 children, if we do have a population crisis among the Indigenous people, which we certainly do have, then anything that can help them to have more children is a good thing. And many people would be prepared to pay their taxes in order to keep the population alive. However, many people are against that. They're against abolishing the cap because they recognize that lots of people who are coming into the country have very large families. And so many of us don't want to be thought to be paying for them to have even bigger families. And so that's an example of how mass immigration has kind of messed up what otherwise is the social contract, the idea that many of us are quite happy to pay to pay for benefits for people to have children, to keep the country going. We don't have a problem with that, but we do have a problem when it's just going to be given to foreigners, essentially. because that's not what our welfare state, what our national welfare state it was meant to be about. It's not an international welfare state. It wasn't meant to be an international welfare state. It was meant to be a British welfare state for people born and bred in the United Kingdom. But once you open the borders, then all of that goes with the wind. It goes with the wind, and people don't want to be paying their taxes anymore if they're not going to be seeing the benefit of it, or if it is going to go to people who don't have any right to get those benefits. True words, and we will speak them to the extent that we can here at A Force for Good. Now, before we bring on our guest, I just want to show you an amazing thing that we've done this week, and I want to thank our graphic designer for putting this together. This was my idea, and it's been germinating for about a year or so, and we didn't have the money to do it, but with our crowdfunder, we raised a sufficient amount of additional money that we were able to produce this card, which is a replica of a World War I recruiting poster. Now, we are generally against war, and we're not militaristic in that sense, but we do commemorate those who fought and died for us in the hope that they don't have to do it again. And this particular recruiting poster, is your home here, defend it, is not only interesting from a historical point of view, it's very educational as well about the British Army, and it shows the entire British Isles. Check this out. The entire British Isles, and you might not be able to see it here, but it's broken down per county, and the names of the regiments throughout Scotland, England, all of Ireland and Wales are clearly stated. Really educational piece. And all this writing down here, it's clear, although you would need to put your glasses on to read it, but no fear, we have repeated it on the back here. So an extremely educational piece that we have produced, and we're selling these cards for essentially £1 each, which I mean is a giveaway really, and you can get these at our shop, aforceforgood.uk/shop-1. Really pleased with the way that's turned out. This is what I call heritage. There's a difference between history and heritage. Heritage is history which is living today, and we have resurrected this poster and we are making it live again. This is heritage, living history, otherwise known as heritage. Now, you can get a pack of 6 of these absolutely free if you enter our competition. And I'll ask you a question about that in a few minutes. But before we go over to Avellina in about 6 minutes' time, I just want to do On This Day in British History. And on this day in British history is the day that our hero here at A Force for Good, James VI, became King of Scots. And that's why we are flying the British royal family's standard as used in Scotland, which is quartered with the English lions, 2 lion rampants, and the Irish harp. And that's who we're commemorating today. Now, of course, James VI was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and it was on this day that she abdicated as well. So she was imprisoned in Lochleven Castle because she had fallen out with the nobles who were very suspicious of this Catholic lady. And so they imprisoned her in Lochleven Castle. And after a few weeks, she abdicated. And she was nevertheless, so that what that meant was that her infant son, her infant son, who was only like 13 months old at the time, James VI, became the King of Scots. And of course, he had to have a regent to look after him, who became like almost like the effective King of Scotland at the time. And boy, did James VI go through his regents, because they all ended up in very bad circumstances. But anyway, she stayed imprisoned in Lochleven Castle until she escaped one night with the help of some of her supporters. And there's a wee picture there of her escaping. And that's a rather overly romanticized painting, because it shows the wee baby in her arms, but in fact the baby had been taken off her, and she was not with it in Lochleven Castle, unfortunately for her. Okay, and so what then happened is James's regent, James Stuart, set to war with Mary, and there was a battle called the Battle of Langside just outside Glasgow, just a couple of weeks after she escaped from Lochleven. And she got her forces, such as they were, got beaten, and she decided to seek refuge in England with Elizabeth I, which was possibly a bad idea. Others suggested that she should really have gone to France, where she would probably have been safer. Anyway, she hoped, I suppose, to convince Elizabeth that she herself, Mary, was the rightful Queen of England, because there was controversy about the extent to which Elizabeth I was the rightful heir. And Mary, Queen of Scots, was nevertheless a direct descendant of Henry VIII as well. And so she used that to try to leverage her claim over the English throne. But of course, as we know, Elizabeth I was having none of it, and eventually put that matter to rest at the chopping block. But when, in the fullness of time, her son, as we know, James VI, was to inherit the throne of England, and in fact was to join the union together at the Union of the Crowns in 1603. So in the fullness of time, Mary's vision became reality. And in fact, Mary is buried in Westminster Abbey now, and an amazing tomb there in Westminster Abbey. Where are we? Let's put up that picture. There we go. She was originally buried at Fotheringay, where she was beheaded, but when her son took the throne, he had her exhumed in 1612 and reinterred in that glorious tomb in Westminster Abbey, right next to Elizabeth I, as it happens. Amazing history. Amazing history. Now, folks, we're about to bring on Avellina, but before we do that, I'll ask you a question, and the winner will get a pack of 6 of these winging their way to them. All you need to do is to send us by email to contact@aforceforgood.uk. Send us the answer to this question. On this day, who became King of Scots? Who became King of Scots on this day? Great stuff. Send in your answers to contact@aforceforgood.uk, and the winner will get a free pack of 6 of these cards, which are unique in the world, winging their way to you tomorrow morning. Good stuff. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please say hello. Please say hello to Avellina Balestri.
Hello.
Hello there, Avellina. Thank you very much.
Hello, Alistair.
Yeah, thank you very much
for having me on.
Good. Well, we had a sound check earlier, and it occurred to us that there is actually the Atlantic Ocean between you and I at this moment, and so the sound is coming in loud and clear as far as I can tell. but thanks to the wonders of modern technology, you're in the room with us, as well as the Atlantic Ocean being in the room with us right now.
Exactly.
Now, there's
It's
a
the
lot
third wheel. It's the third wheel in the conversation, but we'll have to make do.
Exactly. Now, later in the conversation, we're going to get into the drama in the USA at the moment. There's a lot been going on in the last fortnight. No doubt you'll have some comments on that. And before we do that, though, you are an authoress. You have got an interest in the American Revolution, especially from a British perspective, especially from a Scottish perspective as well.
Mhm.
And so, just before we talk about your new book, can you just briefly tell us what made you become so interested in this period of American and British history?
Sure. I think that it really started when I was quite young. I took an interest towards British history in general. It started out with the myths and legends that are mostly settled around the Middle Ages, like Robin Hood, for example, which was the setting for my first novel, Saplings of Sherwood. And then as I grew a little bit older, but I was still in my childhood years, I did take an increased interest in the American Revolution because it was kind of a crossover point for the British history that I so loved and my own local history. I grew up in Maryland, so it's one of the 13 original colonies, but also with family across New York and New Jersey. So my dad would take me up to the bluffs of Fort Lee, which has a lot of American Revolution history involving Washington and Cornwallis essentially chasing each other around and their war of wills and so forth. So there was a lot of material culture that fascinated me about the long 18th century, the time period. It was kind of an in-between time period, I viewed it as, because it sort of straddles, if you will, the time of the sort of the medieval period and the early modern, the Tudor era and stuff like that, the Stuarts, and then ultimately later on the sort of more fully modern period where you start getting photography and so forth. So it kind of was in between where there's still a sense of mystique due to the paintings, for example, the clothing, the general style. There's a sense of both distance and relatability. There's a closer relatability than the Middle Ages in the sense that we can actually read the writings of these people and they're speaking in basically modern English. Give or take, obviously, but you can feel that relatability with the primary sources. And for me, it just always was a fascination in terms of the British and I would say British American side of the story. So these were the Americans who still identified strongly as being British and they were loyal to the crown and so forth. And their stories tend to be forgotten. Their whole kind of cause and rationale was forgotten a lot of the time. And it just deeply fascinated me because I've always felt, have this deep attachment and affection for Britain as an American. And so I always identified sort of in sync that way. And I think that part of the interest actually was also just the mere fact that it was kind of a lost cause. And I know that some people think of like, oh, the lost cause romanticism that you get with sort of the Jacobite rebellions and stuff. But for me, I think it's a little bit deeper. I kind of lean into it because I think it is a very interesting sort of background, you might say, to ask important deep spiritual questions for that matter. That how do you handle defeat in a worldly sense? How do you handle when everything is sort of stripped away from you, when you're under the most severe pressure, when it looks like everything is lost? It's almost a kind of a vibe you get in classic legends and myths when you think about King Arthur, the Battle of Camlan, and the separation of the Knights of the Round Table, the breaking of the Round Table, the destruction of Camelot. I feel like in its own way, the American Revolution contains those components that you had a united Anglosphere and you had a united empire, and it broke apart like the, breaking apart of the round table in a way. And so when I went about trying to write it, I wrote it in that manner. I said, well, let's write it as if we're dealing with a kind of classical tragedy, and we'll bring to it all of those kind of perennial questions that come with the classical tragedy, and hopefully also just to call to mind the fact that we were one people, and in many ways I think that's forgotten. So for me, it's not. I've had some people say this to me where it's like, well, you've had to sort of take yourself out of yourself and put yourself into like another perspective. I'm like, it's not like that for me. It's no more like that for me, I feel, than if I were to say now, for example, that the Union and the Confederate sides of the American Civil War that happened later were not in some way equally of the same cultural heritage. That's how I feel about, the British side, if you will. I feel like the Brits that we're talking about, these characters that have fascinated me since childhood, that I related to since childhood, are equally a part of my own heritage. They're not foreigners. They are part of our heritage. They are part of that fabric. They are, again, brethren, kith and kin, that kind of thing. So that's the way I approach it, as very much of a civil war.
Well, thank you for that answer, because that was an extremely eloquent and well put together, off the cuff explanation of what's driving you. And I like your idea there of how both sides are equally valid, because what tends to happen in politics, and especially in war, is that the defeated get vanquished and everybody forgets all about them. And your one's family goes on through time, and you come to accept that, oh, you were on the winning side, and weren't you great? And then you might look back into your history and you find, oh my goodness, like all our family were actually on the other side. I didn't know that. But society and time has made me just go along with the winning side. And so you're taking a very new, is nuanced the right word? Certainly nuanced, but a much more comprehensive and wider and a much more humane way of actually looking at things. And from a British perspective, I'm very glad that you're doing that, because you are raising out stories that we haven't heard before. And in that sense, that brings us on to your new book, which, how would you categorize it? It's called All Ye Who Pass By, and it's the book one, Gone for a Soldier. So it's what's the name for that genre, which is history but also fiction?
So it's historical fiction. Yes, historical fiction. And so it's the first book in a trilogy that deals primarily with the Saratoga Campaign. So that was the turning point of the American Revolution. It was the campaign under General John Burgoyne. And it was the famous point at which, the fortunes of war shifted. And the defeat of Burgoyne enabled, essentially, down the run of things, the revolutionaries to really gain support and the needed, kind of backing from the European powers that kind of had it in for Great Britain from the previous wars, like the 7 Years' War / French Indian War, etc. So you have them ending up with the support of France, ultimately Spain, and ultimately the Netherlands. So Saratoga, it cannot be underestimated, like in terms of how important this was.
So this was 1777, just to put it in its time period, and the British wanted to draw a line between New England and the other restless colonies.
They wanted to cut New England off. Well, there was a number of reasons for it. But primarily, New England was seen as the seat of the revolution, as the origin point of the Troubles. And it's quite interesting reading, for example, the speeches given by King George III, when he would actually say in one of his earlier speeches during this war, essentially, I thought that it was just, it was sort of a New England rising. That was what he was saying, that his counselors were essentially telling him. And he was saying, I thought it was sort of a localized thing, and you're telling me this thing has spread, it's metastasized. Well, that's a bit bad. Thank you, guys. You haven't exactly been keeping me up to date. And so, they definitely wanted to split the colonies in two. They thought that if they could do that, they could essentially cut off the head of the snake, and it would sort of, kind of writhe around a bit and then die. The trouble was, it was a very complex plan. It sounded good on paper, but it also was very complicated in terms of Murphy's Law and trying to get everything to converge the right way. There was a lot of just stuff that could go wrong, ranging from just the sheer distance that you're talking about, all not just from Britain to the colonies, but also just getting from Canada down to Albany, and then for the other bodies to converge, the other people like General Howe needing to follow up with the plan, and so many things could go wrong and did go wrong. It was a classic tragedy level mess, and that honestly makes for great Shakespearean storytelling. It's kind of delivered on a platter in that sense when it comes to wanting a dramatic story to tell. And most of the time it does tend to be told from the side of the winners. Rarely do we get that kind of focus on, well, what would it be like to be a part of this thing that is just almost has folk horror elements. Trekking through this dense New York State wilderness, and everything that entails. So it really was quite intense for the people involved, and it just got kind of progressively horrific for them, really. So I really try to explore those themes in the story.
Yeah, because we forget about that, of course. It's like you read it from today and think, oh, how could they have done something like that? Oh, that was silly, or that was a bad move, or why didn't they do that or this? But I mean, you're talking about a wilderness, basically. There's no interstate highways that you can roll down. There's no Twitter that you can keep in touch via Messenger or whatever with each other. It's like literally the war for many cases would just be what the commanding officer thought was the best thing to do given the particular circumstances, not knowing what the commanding officers of the other battalions were necessarily doing today. And completely. So the whole thing was just really a game of chance at the end of the day, all these kind of battles back then. And so, I mean, the British lost the Battle of Saratoga, and you were saying that was a defining moment in the war, because their main aim to separate the problematic colonists up in Massachusetts and thereabouts failed at the Battle of Saratoga, which was
and they believed beyond just the fact that the rebellion had begun, had sort of festered in New England. They also were trying to split the colonies in half and get control of the Hudson River. So it came down to trying to secure supply routes and everything else. So it was more than just that it began up there, but that was part of it. There was multiple different reasons. Right. But yeah, there was two battles of Saratoga, by the way. One was on September 19th, and the other one was on October 7th. But then they had like multiple different sort of semi-battles and skirmishes all the way up to that point on the campaign, such as the battle, or some call it kind of a large skirmish of Bennington and various others. But yeah, so the whole campaign, tends to be sort of taken as a whole together. So there's not really a single battle. Right. But yeah, losing, that was really what it was that the defining moment really was when the British line broke in the October 7th battle. And that
October 17th.
October 17 was when he surrendered. October 7th was when the battle took place.
All right. Right. Another October.
So it was 10 days. It was 10 days after the fact that Burgoyne eventually sort of called a convention after pulling a bluff in which he said very dramatically, as was his way, he was a playwright, and I relate to him immensely for that, where he was essentially like, you will either give us terms or we will raise the black flag and neither give nor receive quarter. And so he made a grand dramatic gesture there, and he tried to get the best terms he could, but that did not work out very well in the long term. But it's a long story.
Yeah, there's
It is.
there's that picture of that's the British general there on the left hand side, trying to hand over his sword, but the American, being more of a gentleman, refused to take his sword off him, and we're told that he's gesturing there to the tent to welcome the British general to refreshments. So at least there was a bit of gentlemanly conduct on the battlefield afterwards.
There was, because, well, the interesting part of this was that General Gates, so this was General Horatio Gates, leading the, Revolutionary Army in this case, was himself a born Englishman. He was born in Malden, where the famous Battle of Malden against the Vikings took place. And he was kind of disgruntled, to put it mildly. He used to be a regular British army man. And then he got disgruntled. He felt like he wasn't getting the opportunities that he deserved. There's rumors and speculation that he was illegitimate, the son of a maid and an aristocrat, basically. And then he ultimately gets, from the wealthier side of the families, were paid off to go into the army. But he feels like he's not getting, his just desserts in what he thinks his genius is. So there's that. There's a number of other things. He ends up moving to the colonies, and he ends up on the revolutionary side of things. But he knew of Burgoyne and these other people. So he'd been their comrades. You can make of that
Absolutely
what you will in terms of whether he was a good or a bad person due to that. Sort of the jumping of sides. But I will say that I think, so the thing is, Benedict Arnold gets this specifically bad reputation, and for some good reasons. But at the same time, I think we need to remember that all of these people, to greater or lesser extents, if they're backing the revolution, especially if they'd been in the army in some context, they've taken an oath upon, the cross over the Bible here to the king. So they all are breaking solemn oaths. I think we should remember that to a certain extent, that it was treason, however one wants to define that, if one wants to justify the reasoning behind it, but it still was. And so all of these people were on some level committing just that. So there's that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with you there. That's all been just kind of covered over, of course, with American folk history to an understandable extent.
Well, it's origin. It's origin myth, and it's the fact that, when we get down to it, at the time you had approximately, not strictly so, but approximately a third of the colonists supported the revolution, a third were loyal to the crown, a third were neutral. So it was really just the fact that the one side won that we have this particular folk image of what it actually means to be an American, for example, and to kind of otherize the loyalists. But I feel like I should probably rope around here to General Simon Fraser, because it could be the endless saga down the other way.
That's the subject. Well, I'll just bring up a copy of your book here, All Ye That Pass By, Book 1, Gone for a Soldier. And am I correct in saying that Simon Fraser, Scotsman, is the center of your story here? And he's a real person that you've woven this tale around. So just briefly, before we start talking about the state of America, tell us about your book.
Sure. So, I'll talk about Fraser for a little while. So he is a major character within the trilogy. It becomes increasingly important as the story goes on. So basically, starting at the beginning, Simon Fraser of Balnain was born in Balnain in the Scottish Highlands. He comes from the Fraser clan, which during the Jacobite rebellions tended to waffle back and forth, was fairly famous for it. You have Simon Fraser of Lovat, called the Fox, and he is the clan chief, again, distinct from our Simon Fraser of Balnain. There was tons of Simon Frasers, warn you, like tons of them. But the clan chief famously zigzagged back and forth between politics and religion. So he went from Catholic to Protestant, Protestant to Catholic, and he went from Hanoverian to Jacobite, Jacobite to Hanoverian, back again. This was famous. He ultimately overplays his hand, gets his head chopped off for it. And you have a situation where at Culloden, the Frasers, some of them go out onto the field and meet their doom there, but some are withheld, some are held back. So clearly the Frasers were kind of hedging their bets and trying to figure out whether this thing was actually working out or not, even though they had said they were supporting Bonnie Prince Charlie at the time. And there's a legend about the scree of Culloden, this great black phantom bird that some people to this day have claimed to see up in the Scottish Highlands. And it's based on a lot of old Celtic mythology, based in like the Morrigan, etc., the goddess of death you get from the old myth. But basically, they claim that they saw it just before the battle, like the night before the battle. And some of the people who saw this said, "Oh, no, we're not going on this. We're going to step on out." And so they didn't participate in the battle. And others said, "Heck, if that's our destiny, we go into our doom." So anyway, obviously, Culloden was a complete catastrophe for the Jacobite rebels. And so the Frasers, because of their implications with all this, were brutally punished by the government, by the Hanoverian government, and many people fled the onslaught and the razing of their, properties and lands, and a lot of murder too, and left the country if they could get out. Such was the case of the teenage Simon Fraser of Balnain. So he ends up as an exile on the continent in the aftermath of the 45, and he winds up becoming a mercenary for the Dutch army. And this was something that had something of a history behind it. You had mercenary Scottish regiments fighting for the Dutch for a good long time.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, one of the more famous characters in it, he could be a whole different episode, is Sir General Hugh Mackay, or Mackay, sometimes it's pronounced. And he was very famous during the Glorious Revolution. But he ended up, as you can see, the connection with William of Orange and so forth. So there was this Dutch crossover connection. So at any rate, our Simon Fraser ends up serving in the Dutch army as a Scottish mercenary for a good while, for about 8 years. But then you get the coming of the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, and eventually the British Army says, hey, we want to recruit Highland regiments, right? We are willing to give a pardon to former Jacobites who are willing to come back to Britain, take the oath of loyalty to the Hanoverian king, who at that point was King George II, and go in as officers into the Highland regiments. So Simon Fraser does this. He goes back to Britain and he joins the Highland regiments. So during the French and Indian War, he sees service in North America. And he's involved in the Quebec campaign under General James Wolfe. And legend has it that he was the one. Now, this is somewhat, it's speculated because, as we've mentioned before, there are many Simon Frasers. So many Simon Frasers, it's very confusing. But legend could have been him. Is that when Wolfe's boat was passing by the French sentries on the river at night, they call out to them, and Simon gets up, and because he'd spent a great deal of time on the continent at this point, he became very fluent in multiple languages. He was kind of a linguist. By the end of it all, he seems to know English, Gaelic, French, German, and Dutch. So, and he's very good at imitating accents. So very good. So when he stands up, he basically is able to answer them back in French, in perfect, like, again, you wouldn't think he wasn't a Frenchman kind of French. And so he manages to get their boat through. And then he goes on, they scale the heights of Abraham, he participates in the Battle of Quebec, and in which Wolfe loses his life at the height of his glory, etc. With regards to Wolfe, there's an interesting whole sort of plot with that as well, in the sense that he starts out being very negative about Highlanders. He has a lot of prejudices against them. When the first Highland regiments are formed, he basically says, they're no great mischief to us if they fall. He doesn't really, consider them to be he considers them to be kind of a cannon fodder asset, but not much more. He does not like Highlanders.
It's interesting that you say that, because that's the famous quote that we always hear from the Scottish nationalists, which is meant in some way I'm not quite sure why, but to deprecate either Wolfe or the British Army or something.
Well, here's the fun part. I'll let you go. Yeah. There's a fun part to this, though.
We've just got a few minutes left, but
Lord. Basically, I'll keep going. So basically, what I was going to say is that the part that, yes, the Scottish nationalists just drop off essentially is that Wolfe grows a great deal in his feelings toward the Highlanders, very much so, to the point where he's saying, no, they're like the most manly corps of officers I've ever seen. He's singing their praises by the end of this operation, and you've got the Highlanders saying they'll give you fire and water for the man. They literally bonded like in a super, super way. So all of that. But just to jump back to Fraser. Yeah. So then he ends up, over the course of the years after that war, he serves in Europe in various contexts. And then eventually he marries a German woman. He ends up coming back to the British Isles, and he stakes out in Ireland, which was used kind of as very much of a military stakeout ground at this time period, 18th century. And he ends up basically as the neighbor of General John Burgoyne, before he's a general back then. But anyway, he ends up next door to them. So he and his wife and Burgoyne and his wife are essentially next door to each other. So they become friends. They pick up each other's mail, and they get to know each other quite well, which will eventually have repercussions. So you end up down the line in the American Revolution. Saratoga Campaign kicks in. Well, Burgoyne remembers Fraser, and he says, nobody respects you as much as I do. And there really is something rather lovely about that, in the sense that Fraser had to overcome a lot. There was a lot of still prejudice against Highlanders, and originally Highlanders were only really supposed to, especially those who'd served in the, they were associated with Jacobite clans, right? So essentially, the situation was that they were only supposed to be in command of other Highlanders. They're not supposed to be commanding other people from other places. But Fraser, he can't be kept in his place. He rises. He is commanding people of every stripe. He's commanding all Britons at this point. So he ends up on the top tier at the Saratoga Campaign. You have General Burgoyne, you have General Fraser, and you have General William Phillips, who was the artillery. So you had Fraser in charge of the light infantry and Phillips in charge of the artillery. So he, in some ways, is Burgoyne's hitman to a certain extent, as the advance guard, as the light infantry, doing all of these things. He participates in a number of the early battles and skirmishes, and he's always out in the front, always fighting. They call him a host in one man and the soul of the army. He literally captures the kind of adoration and respect of the entire army. And he's, considered just this extremely, extremely dynamic man, and who cannot be kept in his place, who rises above all opposition. Ultimately, what happens to him is that when you get to the actual battle points, well, you have a situation where Burgoyne decides Britons never retreat. We're not going to back off even when things are going to hell in a handbasket. This is a disaster. And, it just gets to become more and more and more of a disaster as the campaign devolves. Fraser knows this. He's against the final assault that is made, the last Battle of Saratoga. He's opposed to it. He thinks it's a bad idea. But he's going to, of course, take orders, and he's going to go out there and give it his all, even though he thinks it's a disaster and Johnny's losing his marbles. So out there on the field, he very famously rides around breakneck speed. He's practically the only man, well, really, he is the only man holding this line together. He's riding back and forth, swinging his sword wherever the line is breaking. He's there in front of them, encouraging them, trying to hold the line together. And then he realizes, or should I say one of his aides realizes, they say to him, General, you are being inordinately targeted. So it means when the inordinate versus ordinate thing goes on, what simple information is that back in this time period, you weren't supposed to really inordinately specify knocking out the general in that super specified man in a tree way. It was considered uncouth and ungentlemanly, especially if your opposition general like hired effectively an assassin to do it to you. So this is what they would say when they say inordinate targeting. So he's told you are being inordinately targeted. It's not just random lead flying around. And Fraser very famously says back when they say, "Why don't you get down?" And he says, "No, this line will break. I can't." And then they say again, "At least, back up, for heaven's sakes. Get off your horse or back up." And he very famously says, "My duty forbids it." And then continues to ride back and forth. Eventually, he is shot and mortally wounded. The poor man ends up being taken off of the field and taken to the women's quarters, where they think he will be safest. But it's just a really heart-rending scene for someone who's so dynamic and so, larger than life, to be reduced to being laid out on a table. So he's put on a table. He's been shot in such a way that he's sort of effectively been partially disemboweled because it's torn up his, internal organs so badly. It's just terrible stuff. So even though he had such a reputation for courage all the way up to this point, he cannot restrain his groans and his screams, which is so hard for him. And he goes on this cycle of being unable to control his screams and groans and then apologizing to the women and the children and saying, I'm so sorry. And I'm so sorry that he fears he's frightening the children. He's frightening the women. The poor guy is just a mess. So, And then he very famously says, when he's in the midst of all of this, the famous lines, "Oh, fatal ambition, poor General Burgoyne, my poor wife," which is so sad. But also really, again, emotional in the sense that he's thinking of Burgoyne in the midst of all this. Like, this guy sent him to his doom. And so he died.
I'm sure.
So
I'm sure if he was lying with his guts hanging out and screaming, he would be scaring the children. But I suppose back then,
the children, yes.
The children were made of stronger stuff, perhaps, than they were. Yeah, listen, Avellina, it's the top of the hour, so we're just going to have to.
So he dies. He dies. That's the end of it. Is that he dies tragically the next morning, and he's buried out on that hill with that thing. And there's a lengthy funeral that goes on, and it gets cannonaded, and it was all very dramatic. But he's buried there to this day, somewhere out at Saratoga. So that is the story of General Fraser. And if you want to read more, you can read it in this book.
Well, hold your book up. Hold your book up.
I'll hold it again.
That's the point of this. That's your book, All That Passed By, historical fiction, but very true to life, but with some added flavor, by Avellina Balestri. And all you need to do is go to Amazon.com or Amazon.co.uk and type in "All Ye That Pass By," and that in itself will get you the book. And I've just been told that somebody has already bought it. Somebody that's been watching has already bought it. Now let's just look at some of the comments that we've got here as you were speaking. Neil says, "The inability to conceptualize the enemy as honorable rivals, only as enemies of humanity, is one of the ailments of the time." That's Sean Neil Erner who says that. Quite right. TC says, "This is a great chat tonight." Ian, your friend, is in, who says, "How do you handle defeat? How do you handle defeat? Good question for the Nats." TC says, "I have walked the Freedom Trail in Boston and the state of Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Boston founded in 1630. So yes, one or two comments. Everybody loving your. JD says, "I'm loving this. Thanks, Avellina." It's great. It's great to hear an American who understands American history for a start. And it's unusual to find an American who understands American history, but also understands it from the British perspective as well, from a sympathetic angle. That's very unusual, actually, when you think about it, especially that. And of course, what's Paul saying? Paul says, "Family legend myth has it that we, Paul Hadlow's family, are related to General Wolfe on my mother's side." It wouldn't surprise me, Paul. The patriotism continues on down to you. Oksana says, "This is really interesting." Absolutely. Absolutely interesting. And TC says, please have this lady back on again at some point. She's brilliantly interesting, isn't she? Just
Thank you.
Absolutely. And we could fill in, I've got the feeling, a 2-hour program with you, Avellina, because
we could do a jumbo program on redcoats. We really could. There's so many interesting ones. I mean, just on Scots alone, we could fill up, kind of like a mega program or something and sell it on your Amazon store. But really, there's just so many interesting figures.
Well, let's do that. I mean, a jumbo program on redcoats. That's the. I'm writing that. I'm writing that down. That's what we're going to call it. A jumbo prog on redcoats.
I think we could have actually an awesome amount of fun with that.
we absolutely could. An awesome amount of time. And also it occurred to me that Simon Fraser is, of course, the name of the Earl of Lovett, who fought as a British commando in World War II. He was quite famous for his...
And he was a descendant. He was a descendant of the Fox as well. So they went down that line because the Fox's son eventually, also named Simon Fraser, so confusing, eventually got reinstated. So, you ended up with a situation where the line reconnected and you get the ongoing Fraser story in British history.
Right. Okay, so we'll call that to an end. Let me just remind folk, you are the author, Avellina Balestri, of All Ye That Pass By, which can be found on Amazon. And your YouTube is youtube.com/@ Avellina Balestri, AVELLINA Avellina, you've been great company tonight. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for giving up your time.
Well. Oh, it's lovely speaking again. It's really enjoy it. And I love your banner in the background as well. That is awesome.
Absolutely. Well, we're trying to have a different flag each week for whatever is happening that day or around that day in British history. And today, of course, it was the abdication of Mary, Queen of Scots, and the James VI coming to her son, James VI coming to be the King of Scotland, which in the fullness of time made him the King of Great Britain. So yeah, auspicious day, as they say. Okay, Avellina. Yeah, we'll definitely do this again. And we'll definitely have this jumbo program on redcoats, because there's so much to learn. I mean, tonight I just learned there about, I didn't know, I knew the Wolfe's famous comment that the Scottish Nats don't like, but I didn't know that he came to change that comment around and came to appreciate.
No one ever does. They get stuck on that. Yeah, they get stuck on that, and they never check to see, hey, did that evolve and anything? Oh, it's just because they want there to be discord. They don't want anyone to ever heal from the wounds of civil war. They kind of thrive on it. So it's up to us to fix that. Yeah.
It's a good point. People will find the truth at the fringes by reading your books and by watching and listening to A Force for Good. Okay, Avellina, let's do this again. Have a lovely day.
Thank you. God bless. You have a great day.
God bless you too.
Bye.
Bye now. Great stuff. Avellina Balestri, amazing American historian, author, artist and musician. And I never got to mention Avellina's written a song about Simon Fraser, and we'll put the link to that song out on our threads as well. And that's written in the style and sung in the old Scottish style. Now, we don't have a winner tonight of this, but hey, that doesn't matter. We'll roll the prize over until next week. However, those of you who want to buy a pack of these cards, you can do so by going to aforceforgood.uk/shop-1. And these are blank on the inside, and on the back, they detail the writing, which is down here. Really interesting historical piece of British heritage being history living today. We've resurrected this poster to remind us of the past, to remind us of the sacrifice of the British, in order that we may be inspired to improve our country today. Good stuff. Now, it wouldn't be a program unless we gave a quick mention to One Big Country, a big book for the Union, Volume 1. Volume 2 will be out at the end of this year. You can get that from Amazon by simply going to amazon.co.uk and searching for One Big Country. For those who want to know what the Union is all about, this is your primer. And just as that's a big book, this is a wee book. And this can easily be read within half an hour, and it will also tell you what the United Kingdom is all about. 2 pieces of material that everybody needs in their intellectual armory. There we go. Screenshot. Okay, folks, we'll be back next week. We're aiming to have a guest next week also at 7 o'clock to 8 o'clock every Wednesday night. This is A Force for Good. It just remains for me to say, God bless the United Kingdom and God save the King. See you next week.